David Dropkin. David, how's it going today, man?
Going good. Going well, yeah. I'm really still buzzing from being at Breaking Convention, Carl. Loved it, mate. How about you? How you doing?
Doing good. Yeah, we just got some snow here in Colorado, and it's already melting. So that's fascinating to see how quick the snow melts up here. It was like 7+ inches, and then within 2 hours it was gone. I'm like, oh, that's fascinating.
Wow, very fleeting.
Yes. Cool. Well, this is fun. We haven't recorded a podcast in a while together, so excited to be on here with you today. But before we get going here, just some reminders. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And check us out on any of the social media channels. We're everywhere from Twitter to Instagram to Facebook, LinkedIn, and TikTok. Some upcoming news. We have our neuroscience class kicking off, demystifying psychedelic neuroscience with Dr. Melanie Pincus and Manesh Gurn. You can learn more at psychedeliceducationcenter.com, and that will kick off on May 17th. And then I believe that will be at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And it's going to be a kind of hybrid course. There will be some pre-recorded material along with some live meetups, 8 weeks long. So you'll get to interact with Melanie and Manesh on that course, and it is going to be awesome. So if you're interested in checking that out, at psychedeliceducationcenter.com. I think that's probably it for some announcements. We're week 2 in Vital, which has been really, really awesome. And yeah, I just got to teach a class with you this morning. Study groups are really awesome and really fascinating discussions. So yeah, how are you feeling about it, David?
Yeah, it was great. I love teaching, holding space, just getting to know students from around the world. It's amazing. We've got a bunch of students from Crested Butte in Colorado. I think 5 of them have joined Vital this year. And yeah, wild. Just, we've got a student from Iran, and it's just amazing. And Nepal, the diversity of our students are doing incredible work. Yeah, I'm really pumped for this one.
Yeah. All right, well, let's dig in. So yeah, you and Johanna were just at Breaking Convention over at Exeter University over in the UK. Would love to hear any updates. What was that like? What was it like to be at Breaking Convention? What stood out for you? Any highlights that you want to share?
It was, amazing. I think I have to write a book about those 4 days editing, and literally just left the kids, jumped on a plane, got a red eye, went with my wife Faggy, and we went and met my parents for lunch in Bristol. Nice. And then, had just a beautiful experience getting to know the British and European psychedelic community, because I really know a lot of folks over here in the North America, so it's a totally different scene. It's great, it's definitely...
How's it different?
Breaking Convention in particular, if you imagine like a spectrum that gets, different poles of the spectrum, it's the other end of Wonderland, and kind of microdose. It's like a lot of dreadlocks, crusty, kind of, hippie environmental activists, very kind of spiritual, festival-going folks. Just a little bit more, just grassrootsy, to be honest.
Cool.
Beautiful conversations with people. It was the first time Johanna and I met, so that was just great because we've been teaching together every week for the last year. And then we did a meetup in this beautiful North African restaurant, probably like on the 6th floor of this 300-year-old building in Exeter.
Wow.
There were 14 of us, alumni from last year, students from this year. And it was wonderful. And Exeter's just full of these really old buildings. I'd never been there my whole life. There were some pubs that were like 500 years old and a cathedral that's like 700 years old.
That's
just
really cool.
Beautiful architecture. And then the conference itself, amazing speakers. Rick Doblin, Paul Stamets, Amanda Fielding, Graham Hancock were just some of the highlights. And it was quite moving at times when Rick Doblin and Paul Stamets did their talk. They got standing ovations, and it just felt like, wow, we really are on the cusp of something here. And both of those guys have been doing this for 30 old years. I got to interview Amanda Fielding. She's been doing this for 60 years. And all of them were saying, things have changed. We're in a really good place now, but there's still such a long way to go and so much just hypocrisy about it. The biggest piece for me, though, Carl, was at our Psychedelics Today stand. A very normal person came up and wanted to have a chat with me about psychedelics, and she said, I'm here for my kid, for my teenager. And so we sat down and spoke for about maybe 45 minutes together about what she's been going through. Her teenage child had a couple of years of really intense psychiatric issues, including hospitalizations, suicide attempts, self-harm. Nothing had worked from the kind of psychopharmacology, psychotherapy school. And so, she had then managed to get her kid some MDMA and psilocybin as just a kind of last chance to survive and not kill themselves. So it was amazing to hear how that has helped them, and they have not tried to kill themselves since then. And they're kind of
That's amazing.
Back at school and able to just be trusted to be safe. And the mom is feeling just much better. And that, for me, totally normal woman who's never done psychedelics herself. I don't think she'd even listen to our podcast, but she was there just to learn about how to help her daughter, and how to help just other folks that are having similar issues. So for me, that just really resonated with why we're doing what we're doing here. And there was one beautiful moment on the dance floor, drum and bass dancing, the kind of final night party. It was just pure drum and bass in one of the rooms, which is my favourite music. And there was a Frenchman on the dance floor. I don't know how we got talking, and he is apparently one of the world's largest art collectors of psychedelic art. He has 80,000 pieces of psychedelic artwork. So just amazing bumping into him. And then we had a little get together of Israeli kind of psychonauts and psychedelic researchers, and Leo Roseman was there. Just beautiful to connect with the Israeli crew that were there. And just lots of grassroots people. What I realised is it's a community, loads of volunteers that come back every year to help there, and it's a real community of people that have been doing this since 2011. So it's grown over time, and it's a beautiful thing to be part of. Yeah, I felt very lucky, to be honest.
It's always been on my bucket list, and I really wanted to try to make it out there, but with it, because it's usually in the summertime, and it was just a little too much trying to get to the UK, launching Vital in the same week. But I'm glad you and Johanna were able to do it and make it out there. And yeah, I mean, there's some cool stuff kind of brewing over at Exeter. I know that they just launched their what is it, a post...
Yeah, I think it's a postgraduate
certificate
masters,
program, postgraduate, and so there's some cool little stuff kind of forming over there, and we partnered up with them a while ago. Joe and I and Lenny had a little feature in their philosophy of psychedelics book, and which has just released. In paperback. Before it was hardcover, and it was like, I don't even know, 200 something bucks. But now, if anybody's listening and they want to go check out that philosophy of psychedelics book, it's in paperback, and I'm sure it's probably going to be a lot cheaper than the hardcover.
Oh, awesome! Yeah.
How do you compare the scene in the UK versus here in the States a little bit more? I know I've always hear with drug laws and regulations in the UK, it's a little behind, but I always think there's so much great stuff coming out of the UK, right? All the research that comes out of Imperial, but it seems like drug laws are a little bit more conservative there. So I don't know. Did you notice a difference in perception around psychedelics?
Yeah,
there versus the US?
Yeah, good question. I guess I definitely noticed drug laws are tighter there compared to where we are anyway. In Jersey, you can't smoke cannabis; it's illegal anywhere. And now I bumped into this one guy, and he had cannabis, but he gets it prescribed for fibromyalgia, but they're not allowed to call it that. It's actually prescribed by a private clinic, and they call it cannabis-based medicinal products. But you open up the bag, and it's just cannabis flower. So, but they're just not allowed to call it that because that's still a Schedule 1 drug. So obviously ludicrous. And I guess let me think about the other piece. One thing I did notice was around the National Health Service and how in England a lot of the big pharma companies, say Awaken, Compass Pathways, that are doing psychedelic research, I think also small pharma maybe with their DMT work, they're basing their clinical trials in National Health Service clinical treatment sites, which is awesome. So rather than do it in a ketamine clinic or a private practice, it's being done by the National Health Service. So it makes it a lot more easy to fast track that and to the real world. How does it fit into a national health supply chain. So that was really cool to hear, particularly, I interviewed Celia Morgan, who's at Exeter University, where Breaking Convention was, and she's saying that their phase 3 trial is going to be in 20 different NHS sites over Scotland and England.
Amazing.
Yeah, so 20 different places, just for diversity, they're doing it in that way. And these are like National Health Service. Like I can't quite explain to American people what that's like. So, when you want to go see a doctor or go to a hospital or see a specialist or even a dentist, you go to the NHS. And so they're going to be doing these trials with DMT, and ketamine and psilocybin in these places where you go to, if you got a bad leg. So it's just amazing that it's the same system that this is already being integrated into.
When are they planning on starting some of that? Is that going to be pretty soon?
Yeah, definitely. Hopefully we'll release that interview with Celia Morgan shortly. But yeah, it's imminent. They're designing, the trial parameters. I think they've maybe even got their 20 clinical trial sites nailed down. And yeah, Compass Pathways are already doing that work in the NHS already. So it was great. I didn't quite appreciate that, to be honest. It's amazing.
Yeah. Appreciate it that it's happening there. Yeah. Compass is doing it.
Yeah. Oh, interesting point. Interesting. Yes, I appreciate the meta piece that that the NHS is open to this, and that in England you can do psychedelic clinical trial work in the NHS. But yeah, I'm not too sure about the finer details, say, of how Compass Pathways compensate clinicians working on the trial, or how the agreements get made with clinical trial sites. I definitely would love to see all of the small print.
Yeah. Awesome. Anything else that you want to share about Breaking Convention? Like, I don't know if there was any talks that really stood out to you, or if you were just kind of tabling most of the time. I know sometimes when I go to conferences, it's hard to get away from the table and whatnot to go see talks.
Yeah, I mean, I was at the table a lot. I was doing a few interviews. I was, just chilling out a lot. But there was a couple of talks I did make. A few of the big ones. There's one that Rick Doblin did. I'll mention that later, because we're going to talk about MAPS and MDMA. Pulse damage was amazing. I think there was one smaller talk that Dr. Leo Roseman did. He's at one of the OGs at Imperial College London, and his talk was titled something like Mysticism and the Messianic Complex, and how psychedelics can create this kind of false messiah narrative. We're going to change the world and receive some kind of divine message, and I'm going to, create a revolution all of myself. So that was a really interesting talk. And at the end, he was saying, we often think that we've domesticated animals, we've domesticated agriculture, that we're in control. But he was actually talking about, in a way, wheat has domesticated us, because it's put us into these houses and kind of industrialization, urbanization, led us to different kind of lifestyle, and thinking about how psychedelics might be domesticating us as well, like they're changing our just our reality and our social narrative. So it was very interesting to think about kind of this mystical complex of being domesticated by psychedelic compounds and entities.
It's fascinating. It's kind of like what Michael Pollan proposed in Botany of Desire, and I'm not too sure if he snagged that from anywhere as well, but right, like looking at different plants and humans' relationships with those plants, and how, who's actually in control here, right? Because sometimes these plants are evolving in a way to attract attention, to keep their evolution going, right? And so they're constantly adapting. And I know, if nobody read or seen that video, Michael Pollan's Botany of Desire, they go over the potato, the apple, cannabis, and the tulip. And they all represent a desire within us. The tulip is beauty. The potato had to do with like hunger and starvation, thinking about like the potato famine and stuff like that. Cannabis was our kind of desire to alter our consciousness and shift consciousness, and how cannabis is starting to get just way more psychedelic, right? In the way that like, the THC content is just like through the roof nowadays. And then the apple was, I think, our desire for sweets, and how that originally apples didn't start off sweet. That was something that started to that started to happen over time. The way then humans started to kind of, shift it. So yeah, who's really in control here? Is nature, is humans? It's an interesting question. I mean, we're all part of it, we're not separate of it, but it is interesting to think about. Yeah. And I wonder what that role of psychedelics could be playing.
Yeah. And it's nice, just what you said, Carl, to think about how we are part of it. It's not quite so binary, who's controlling who. Yeah, kind of that coexisting. And I think that's a nice segue into our first article. And I also want to, as a segue, say that the author of the first article we're going to talk about, which was in Vice, the article is called "Inside the Quest to Decolonize Psychedelics." So I met the author, Holly Regan, at Breaking Convention. We hung out quite a bit, quite a few days. And yeah, they're awesome person. Really hope to read more of their work. And so, yeah, the article's really talking about a lot of different facets of what we're seeing happen in psychedelia right now. And that's why I was saying this idea of the non-binary part of it. It's both non-binaries in gender identity, but also as kind of cultural narratives as well. And yeah, what were some of the takeaways you got from the article?
After reading this article, really got me thinking just around, this is happening. It's not happening just in the kind of medical world, right? I think in this article, they made this comment that like 90% of, psychedelic use happens outside of the clinical and medical. And then like, only like 10% of that is like, ceremonial use. And just so thinking about how people are using psychedelics, and the way that like where we're going, is, a little different than how humans have been kind of engaging with these medicines. And then just thinking about like accessibility, right? Like, I thought this was like a really interesting fact, just the need for diversity in the field. And they highlighted this point that only 4% of US therapists are Black, and then only 12% are queer. And so, there's very few trained in kind of culturally informed care, which then making peer support actually really important. And so, yeah, I think one of the main takeaways I really took from this article is we need this kind of diverse field to play in. And what does that look like? And it is going to be tricky, right? Like, I think we need clinical trials. We're going to need the medical field, all this stuff. And I was listening to a podcast last night, I think, and, it kind of got me thinking about like regulatory boards and licenses, right? And how, there might be a lot of people kind of doing underground psychedelic, I don't know if they're calling it psychedelic psychotherapy work, but how even just saying that you could be practicing that really goes against licensing boards, right? Like, you need to be licensed because states, dictate that, right? And like, so I think like how does the field progress in psychedelics, and then just mental health care in general, right? Because I think mental health care is inaccessible to a lot of folks here in America. Healthcare and mental health care are super inaccessible. And so, yeah, just thinking about more of these kind of community models and, yeah, how to kind of decolonize psychedelics. It's a big combo, and kind of lots of different points to hit here.
Yeah, there were loads of different points. It was great just to see how many different angles are right now being debated and kind of evolving and in flux. And one takeaway I had was that there's no one really controlling this, psychedelic renaissance. Yes, it probably does exist, but there's just so many different players, so many different narratives, and it's been going on for so long that there are some parts of society that are just going to keep doing what they've already been doing, underground healing, ceremonial circles, recreational use. That's going to continue. Yeah, we'd love to have more harm reduction, more competence in there, but if the model that we build doesn't allow that in, they're just going to keep doing it outside of the model. And if the rules and the legislation doesn't allow for that, then it'll just continue. So it's really needs some big conversations here about how to make space for everyone, but to keep it safe.
As you're speaking, something just kind of like pops in my head, just thinking about like regulating medicine and licenses and stuff like that, and just thinking about with psychedelics, it's like people are having, like, you know, people can describe this as like an experience where they're healing, and healing is usually within a medical model. But like with psychedelics, at least from some of my experience, it's like more about just like exploring our own human experience, and healing just seems to happen that way, right? It's not like you're going in for surgery and, you know, something, you know, you're taking like these antibiotics and doing healing on this type of way. You know, psychedelics offer us this opportunity to explore who we are in lots of different ways. And how should that be regulated? You know, should that field be regulated in a medical way when really it could be very spiritual for somebody? And, you know, does that fall within the realm of spirituality and religion? And people have been doing this for quite a while, in small groups, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's beautiful. That is a realization that just keeps knocking me out. That when we're talking about psychedelics, it's not medical or mental health, it's human. It's about the essence of who we are and connecting with that and with each other. And so that kind of, I think this article really talks about the peer support model quite a bit, and understanding particularly around the intersectionality of individuals being a really important determinant of how they want to heal, and that healing actually needs to sometimes be held in a place of trust and safety with people that look and feel and identify the same. So BIPOC, peer support, and LGBTQ, queer support in particular, it's really important. So they interviewed folks like, you know, Hanifa Naya Washington and Ifetai Harvey and Reggie Harris, and it was really cool to hear their voices being platformed in this article. So yeah, I loved just the breadth of where it went.
There's this quote here by Charlotte James, one of the co-founder medicine woman, it looks like, of People of Color, People of Color Psychedelic Collective Liberation Training. But this quote that they were highlighting big, bold, they say it's more accessible because the cost is so much less. But if it's less optimized or even re-traumatizing, is it really access? And that's like a really interesting thing to think about, because, you know, on the flip side here, right, we were just talking about like community use, more kind of spiritual peer support, making it more accessible. But, you know, over the years, especially at Psychedelics Today, I mean, we've gotten lots of reports of people going to these maybe ceremonial spaces and getting traumatized, right? Maybe it's cheap. Maybe it's like large groups. You have folks that don't have proper training or haven't maybe been doing this for too long. And then, you know, they're dealing kind of with the aftermath of going to a really horrible, you know, ceremony or whatever they want to call it, right? So, you know, that is an interesting thing to think about. Then regulation, like, you know, what does training look like? What do people need? Some sort of proper credential to not kind of perpetuate harm within these circles and these communities. So it's this weird kind of double-edged sword, I think, of like, you know, how do we make it accessible and like lean on peer support? But then, you know, how do we also make sure people are properly trained and like are actually providing safe places? And I worked in a peer support place for a year, and, you know, I saw the benefit of it, right? It did make it cheaper. You know, you weren't paying, you know, a therapist rate for support for folks. But I also saw some like, you know, like things that I didn't always agree with, which, you know, sometimes I think when you do get some of that clinical training, you understand kind of boundaries and ethics a little bit more. In that peer support model, I definitely saw some boundaries getting crossed in really interesting ways. And I'm like, is this actually helpful for the person staying here? And whose experience is this really about? You know, is it the peer support worker, or is it the resident that's staying here who actually needs support? And so, you know, it's complicated, I feel like.
Yeah, that was a really good point the article made, is making psychedelic therapy more accessible, cheaper. You know, you take out a lot of the, in a sense, the guardrails, the preparation, the integration, you know, the more experienced space holders and clinicians. And so is that ethical? it's accessible, but is that ethical? Really, it's a difficult question to answer. And I think because we're talking about psychedelics, which are a lot more complicated than, say, a more simple medical procedure, like getting a foot rub, for example. You don't want to mess around with this. You don't want to take risks with your consciousness, with your whole psyche, with your, life narrative and kind of epistemological construct. You don't want to mess around with that. Just let anyone or anything and kind of mess around with that. So accessibility, and it should be like true equality is where accessibility means the quality is high, that we all have access to high quality, safe, transparent treatment. And particularly the article made one final point that I loved, that it may, again, reinforce that in the West we've grown up in such an atomized, individualistic, kind of reductionist narrative where there's something wrong with me, so I'm going to go and get healing. And yes, there is something wrong with me. I have my shadow and my stuff that I'm working through, but it's not just that I'm actually working through. And there's so much more that we are living in a sick society, in a traumatized society, that we actually need collective healing to be part of in order to truly heal. So when we just let go of this idea that every one of us needs our own little treatment plan, our own little, ketamine journey, and off we go to the doctor's office or do it at home with eye shades, that could be part of it. But there's just so much healing that happens with other people, like being witnessed, being held, just, holding space for each other. And having that, community, like Breaking Convention, really reinforced the value of community. And there were so many queer people there and BIPOC folks there. And it was awesome to see just how diverse, and definitely a lot more neurodivergent folks that were there. It was just great to be part of. One random tangent. I noticed, gosh, English people smoke a lot of cigarettes. And they drink a lot more alcohol, and they do actually have bad teeth. So all those things that you hear about, they're still bloody true, So it was interesting,
Yeah. That's funny. And there's another. A lot. This article is really kind of exploring access, and as we're talking about like these community models, and then like the medical model, and like how does access happen, just even kind of calling out like a lot of queer and BIPOC communities, experience trauma and then also maybe don't have access to these systems or have been abused and neglected by these systems for a long time, right? And so as, maybe this medical model rolls out, does that actually even make it accessible to folks with that kind of mistrust and abuse that's really happened? And so, these are really important things that, I think the world needs to think about. But again, this is a lot of systemic kind of racism, right? And how is that affecting all sorts of communities? And if communities don't trust those systems, should we say that you can't do this type of work and you can't heal because you need to do it within this one system? Or, are we able to support community models where maybe that's actually where healing happens? We were talking a little bit today and last night in our vital study groups. This came up. I read this book with my multiculturalism and diversity class in grad school, and I think the title of the book is "When the Spirit Falls Down and Catches You," something along those lines. But it was really kind of a story explaining. It was about the Hmong people, and this family immigrated to America, and the daughter had epilepsy, daughter or son, and the family wanted to use traditional treatments on the daughter, but the Western medical model was saying that's neglect and almost like child abuse, right? And then it was like they didn't want blood being drawn because they believed that I forget it's been a while since I read this book, but it was like maybe like taking part of the spirit out by doing blood drawing, but it was like the Western medical model needed to do that to understand what was going on, and then I think at one point Like DCF came in and took the child away a little bit because they weren't following Western medical rules, where they were really trying to rely on some of their traditional healing that maybe incorporated some kind of shamanic animistic approaches. And so, it's a really kind of interesting dynamic. And I think that really kind of plays into with psychedelics and what we're kind of developing here, right? It's like, how do these systems come together and maybe learn from each other instead of saying it needs to be one way or the other way, right?
Yeah, you nailed it there, Carl. 100%. And we're at that nexus right now of these, in a sense, opposing poles clashing with each other. And there's not just, we can't just have one system. We need multiple systems, especially because we do live in a colonized and deeply racist and unequal system and society. So yeah, we have to somehow evolve socially and culturally, but at the same time, because we can't wait for that to happen over generations, we just got to get healing out and enable folks to hold space for each other the way that they need it and want it.
Yeah. There's a quote here by Chris Timmerman of Imperial College. From the Western perspective, we're obsessed with the binary of the real versus the non-real, scientific validation versus not, internal versus external world. But if you talk to the indigenous or mestizo shamans, they don't really care much about that idea of reality. It's interesting.
Yeah, everything is real.
Yeah. Cool. Anything else about this article that you wanted to hit?
That was awesome. Yeah, I just recommend everyone to read it because it contains so many different angles. So, yeah, thanks, Holly. Good article.
Yeah. Yep. And again, important conversations we need to be having. It's not just the psychedelic world, right? It's the systems in general, and like, how we're operating in these systems, and do we need some sort of full system kind of revamp? I think a lot of people started saying that during the pandemic, right? Seeing all these kind of structurally weak points within healthcare and mental health care. And, can we kind of keep that going, right? It's like, I feel like we kind of got a little bit of a taste of what those weak points were during the pandemic. And, how do we continue to push and create change, and maybe create that a new system that's a little bit more encompassing and holistic.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
All right, should we go to the next one, Carl?
Yeah. All right. Next one up is for Marijuana Moment, and they're covering what's been going on in Colorado. So the title is Colorado Senate Passes Psychedelic Regulation Bill. So, yeah, I believe they just actually had a meeting last night, which was April 25th. And I believe they passed, and I think it still needs to get approved, but they passed it through the House. Was it SB23-290? So a little bit, yeah. So after Prop 122 passed last year, the initiative called for an advisory board to develop regular recommendations for legislation and access. As that hasn't been established yet, Senate President Steve Fenberg filed a bill that would establish a separate regulatory framework. The 87-page bill was filed on 4/19 and was heard in the Senate Finance Committee on 4/20. The bill received mixed reactions, with some strongly opposing the proposal because of what they considered to be excessive regulations. There's a quote here by a citizen lobbyist, David Nadelson. The biggest concern right now are the obvious recriminalizations of common traditional uses of natural medicine. The simple act of ceremonial sharing of sacred medicine in a forest is criminalized. Growing plants outdoors criminalized, except for small fenced-in spaces. Guides and healers cannot be compensated when natural medicine is involved. And that was, I think, some of the fear, this bill was kind of proposing. And so people were kind of trying to speak out against that. So they passed the legislation in a 5-2 vote on 4/20, and then sending it to the Appropriations Committee, where it then passed by a vote 25-10. And so now it heads to the House of Representatives. So what this bill contains. The bill would maintain the voter-approved ballot measure policy of placing no limits on personal possession of psilocybin, ibogaine, mescaline, which not derived from peyote, DMT, psilocin, and psilocybin by adults 21 and older. There would be a pathway for record sealing for people with prior convictions for psychedelic-related activities that have been made legal. An indigenous community working group, which was not contemplated in the ballot initiative, would be created within the Department of Regulatory agencies to identify and address unintended consequences of the reform, particularly as it concerns the possible commercialization of psychedelics and religious and spiritual exploitation of Native people. Number 4 here, licensed psychedelic businesses will be able to deduct expenses for their state taxes in a partial workaround of federal 280E provision. So that's like a tax provision that once you kind of start becoming touching of a federally legal substance, there's some issues there. So that's really interesting that they'll be able to actually work with that. And then initially, psilocybin and psilocin could be administered at healing centers, but regulators could add additional psychedelics. The bill differs from the ballot measure by making it so regulators would be able to authorize the supervised use of ibogaine at facilities at any time, rather than waiting until at least June 1st, 2026, as in the cases for mescaline and DMT. That one's really interesting, just thinking about all of the substance use, that if there could be these ibogaine clinics getting rolling, I think that would be huge for those really struggling with substance use, to be able to get that supervised, because there's tons of people that are struggling, and I know a lot of people are trying to leave the States, go down to Mexico or wherever to get that type of treatment. And I mean, to be able to create some sort of framework where people can get that safely within the States, that's huge. That's really big.
Yeah, so I know those are our 5 main kind of positive things we see developing in Colorado from looking at the article. That one also took my eye, Carl, about ibogaine. I was like, oh, really? I wasn't expecting that. I'm not in Colorado. I'm not an expert on what's going on there. I have to kind of preface that. But just seeing that piece, there must be some kind of conversation there where folks are saying, that the addiction fentanyl problem is not going away. Overdose levels are not going down. We need to do something about it, and ibogaine seems to be probably one of our best hopes, other than just old harm reduction methods. So yeah, I'm really happy about that, because I think ibogaine is obviously more medically complex than say psilocybin to administer. Need a lot more kind of medical workup beforehand, and it's a much longer, more intense trip. But yeah, I think that's great, and I do actually know on the grapevine there are some high-level discussions in one state in America at least for the state to pass their own kind of ibogaine positive statute that enables folks with opioid use disorder to get treatment in the state rather than have to go to Jamaica or Mexico. They're going to say, look, we have a public health emergency right now with opioid overdoses. We need to do this. There's sufficient evidence and kind of REM strategies and clinical protocols that we can do this with the best clinical people, that we can make it happen. So these discussions are happening because otherwise, literally, just nothing else is happening, and people are just dying year on year on year. Like, it's just getting worse, not better. So what are we waiting for? So I'm really happy about that. And then the other piece you said around just the being able to do tax deductions, it seems like a silly little thing, but that's massive, because otherwise, it's really hard to make money doing this piece. So being able to deduct expenses is just like a normal business. Like, yes, we should be able to do that for building an office and getting IT and getting all the equipment and that we need to do. Yeah,
and I think from talking to some folks in Oregon, I don't know if that's even the case in Oregon. Chatting with one of our colleagues over there, I don't know if they were able to build in that 280E provision. So that seems like a huge deal. That's a really huge deal.
Yeah.
There's some other points here. that the bill proposes. So the bill maintains the ballot measures provisions to block localities from banning healing centers, but they say they may enact rules governing time, place, and manner of operations. I know that was like kind of a big thing that came up a few weeks ago when Joe and I were chatting about this, about some places in Colorado, maybe a little bit more conservative, that may not want these healing centers. And so this bill is actually blocking it from, local ordinances passing these, these measures that would block healing centers from popping up in their county or town. So super interesting there.
Yeah, but I still worry, Carl, that even though they're not going to be able to ban healing centers, that with those rules on time, place, and manner of operations, they'll say, yeah, you can only operate like on a Tuesday morning, and you have to have 20 staff members, and you've got to wear a yellow hat, and only people's names beginning with a letter D can come and get treatment there. They're going to make it so inane and ridiculous that they basically are banning centres from viably working there. So unless the regs are really, really well stipulated so that there can't be any unreasonable restrictions placed on healing centres, then yeah, I would worry about it. So it's all just in the proof of the actual fine print there. Yeah, and it's like an interesting thing. We were chatting about this on a few episodes ago, but a lot of rural communities, they don't have access to great healthcare, mental health care, right? And I think those rural communities really kind of get hit. And we were talking about this even in consideration with like ketamine and the Ryan Haight Act, I believe it was, and how some people in those places where they might not have access really kind of benefit from that telehealth aspect, right? And so, I don't know. Yeah. How much power do you give to like a local town if this is a state approved initiative, and having the town people want to make up their decision what happens there? Or saying like, there's a lot of stigma around psychedelics too, right? There may be people there that really want that healing to happen. And maybe they live 2-3 hours away from Denver, we'll say, and it's like, do people then that comes back to accessibility again, right? Do people have time to go take off and drive 3 hours to Denver to receive these services, or take off a whole weekend when it could just happen in their backyard? But a lot of people have that mentality, not in my backyard, when maybe they don't have all the information and are well educated. So yeah, I mean, we're still battling up against public perception around these substances and medicines. Yeah. Especially because Colorado's, quite sparsely populated, quite big, lots of, mountain ranges, probably not that easy to just drive around. And, there was someone I spoke to in England, and just talking about accessibility, they were on a wait list to see a psychiatrist for 2 years.
Wow.
Like, pretty significant depression, but the NHS is really understaffed and overworked. 2-year wait list. So if you're suicidal, you're not going to wait 2 years to see a psychiatrist, And I also know that in America, like out of all the 50 states, I think it is. Out of all the counties in those 50 states, half of those counties do not have a psychiatrist or a psychiatric prescriber in those counties. So half of the entire country. So you got people traveling. That's why telehealth is really important. And if you've got some counties and towns saying, oh no, we don't want that here, you have to take a day off work, you have to borrow a car, you have to, it's just so inconvenient.
Yeah, I think I read a study a while ago that like majority of like prescribers, psychiatrists are localized in cities, right? And so like, yeah, people don't have access to some of those things out in more kind of rural areas. So yeah, some other points here that the bill proposes. So public consumption of psychedelics and underage use would be punishable by $100 fine. There would be 4 categories of licenses: healing centers, cultivation facilities, product manufacturers, and testing facilities. I'm surprised there's not facilitator licensing in there as well. Maybe that's a separate thing that's not in this bill, because I know they have been talking about facilitator licensing and regulation around that.
Yeah, and training licensing as well. Training companies.
Training, yeah. And then the last 3 here, adults can only cultivate natural psychedelics at a private residence in an enclosed space that does not exceed a 12 by 12 feet, unless within a locality that enacted a policy allowing larger grows. Okay, so it sounds like maybe some locality will allow that. Cultivating beyond prescribed limits would be punishable by a $1,000 fine. And, I guess they're probably thinking about that for, distribution, right? If somebody was able to grow like so much of this, instead of having kind of like your personal use limits, right? Like how much medicine do you really need to be growing? But I know, people are really kind of like pushing against that possession limit and growing limit. But, I can also see from like the state perspective, like, you do kind of need some rules around things to understand how to govern, right? And if you are kind of worried about like, just these underground manufacturers popping up, like, yeah, what do you do? Do you just limit space? I don't know, maybe a little reasonable. I'm sure people probably don't think that's always reasonable, but
yeah, it's a little bit scary to say that live on air, isn't it? That we do need some rules, we do need some regulation somewhere. But the question is why? Like, who's it going to keep safe? And for me, what a couple of points that I wanted to just bring up, Carl, was I just feel so blah about the Senate Finance Committee and then the Appropriations Committee talking about this, voting on it, deciding on what's right, what's wrong. What do they know? This is so complicated and nuanced. And just the idea of these, kind of very bureaucratic little subcommittees getting to make these decisions, it's like, that just doesn't sound right, does it? I know they've got a 15-member advisory board of experts to advise on this, on all of the parameters and requirements. So hopefully that 15-member group will be. I think the main thing we've learned from Oregon is that the advisory board will be really open and transparent about conflicts of interest, but also be able to work collaboratively together in best interests of folks that live in Colorado, and then be able to make a very, very strong recommendations to those committees that get to sign off and everything. So I think there's a lot of pressure on those 15 people to really guide this massive pressure.
Yeah, and thinking this is the second state that did this, and everybody's watching. Definitely, everybody's watching Oregon. Everybody's kind of watching Colorado and how it unfolds. And I'm sure there's massive pressure of like, how do we do this right? And yeah, it's probably a lot. And then there's two more things here with the bill. So synthetic psychedelics are not permitted. So possessing psychedelics with, quote, hazard materials like solvents would be considered a Class 2 felony. And then facilitators who provide psychedelic services, including community-based healing programs and counseling, could not be compensated or reimbursed if they're operating outside the licensing framework. And I thought there was something else in the bill, and I could be wrong about this because I read the actual bill. I know Marijuana Moment's probably just doing some recap, but I thought there was something in there that they would allow those communities like harm reduction kind of decrim services.
That was a couple days later.
Compensated?
Yeah,
was it?
A couple days later, I don't know what committee it was, but in the Senate somewhere, they actually tagged on, okay, it's okay to be paid, but only for harm reduction support services, but there can't be any advertising of those harm reduction services. So like, how can they be harm reduction if they're not advertised? That causes harm. So yeah, it's still not for space holding, it's just for harm reduction, but it's better than nothing, I suppose.
Yeah, and I don't think you can sell the product or provide it. Or maybe you can't get compensation for the product. You may be able to provide it, but you can't get money off of that. So you could sell that harm reduction service. You just wouldn't be able to provide them or sell the medicine or get compensation from the medicine. Fascinating. Really, really kind of fascinating. And then
anything else from that article, Carl?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, so I guess we'll just continue to see if, as this moves forward, if it gets like signed into kind of the bill. But I was watching some of the videos, and part of it's like they were suggesting that they need a framework, they need a regulation. They're trying to learn from their mistakes with cannabis, and how to kind of like get ahead of things. And there's going to be so many different kind of opposing views here on how this gets rolled out. But I guess we'll see. I guess we'll see how it all unfolds.
Stay tuned. All right, so the next article is talking about MDMA and MAPS in particular. It is in nature.com. It's by Sarah Reardon. It's titled US Could Soon Approve MDMA Therapy, Opening an Era of Psychedelic Medicine. So I think we all heard about this and know about it, but there's no harm in just reviewing just the status, because it is still evolving. Like, there's still so many questions around when's it going to happen, what's it going to look like, who's going to allow to be a practitioner, how much is it going to cost. So tons of questions, and this article doesn't answer a lot of those, but it does really just try and give a summary of where we're holding right now. It says that interestingly that the label that the FDA approves will likely include both MDMA plus therapy, obviously in combination, so not just one but both, and that's something that they haven't done before. And then Mason Marks in the article saying that enables the FDA to define that label without having to reclassify MDMA as a Schedule 1 drug. So we're all had up until this point thought that MDMA would need to be reclassified to Schedule 2 or 3, but from what this article is saying, maybe not. So I don't know, just on that point, that's pretty significant.
That's pretty fascinating. Yeah, I wonder what the argument there is, because it's getting combined with psychotherapy, that they wouldn't, you figure you'd have to reschedule anyways, because then it is then classified as having some therapeutic effect.
Well, I'm thinking that through doing it that way, without rescheduling MDMA, they're saying this pill made by MAPS isn't MDMA. It's an MDMA-like substance, a bit like that bloke I was saying in England that had cannabis. It smelt and smoked and felt like cannabis, but he's saying no. They call it a medicinal. A cannabis-based medicinal product. So I think by just changing that terminology, it's like MDMA is different. That's still scheduled. It's a narcotic drug. So I think that's maybe why they're conceptualizing it like that.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's really fascinating. Well, I guess we'll see how things unfold with the FDA as things progress with the research.
Yeah, and I had a few observations from the talk that Rick Doblin gave. He just was brilliant, to be honest. He went on and on at the end, so they were trying to get him off stage, but he just had so much amazing stuff to share. Like, we were like let him talk, keep going. It was great. But it was just before the closing ceremony. So Rick said this amazing thing at Breaking Convention, that actually England might use MDMA within the NHS before America gets it reclassified and medicalised by the FDA, because, and this could be maybe the one good thing about Brexit and Britain leaving the EU, is that they're no longer beholden to the European Medicines Agency, the EMA. So if they want to act independently, and he's saying there are some high-level discussions and potential that MDMA-assisted therapy could become mainstreamed in England before it does America, which is great to hear. And he also was saying that once the FDA and the EMA approve MDMA, it will therefore automatically be accepted by the rest of the developing world, and without any additional need for further clinical trials in each of those individual countries and continents. So it'll just so that was great to hear as well. One piece that stood out for me was he had a slide that he presented to everybody of a clinic that they had mocked up as being a psychedelic wellness clinic. And on the windows of this kind of mock clinic were all the different companies and compounds that were used in there. So it had MAPS, MDMA, it had Usona and Compass Pathways for psilocybin, and it had ketamine. So it's a psychedelic wellness center. And just seeing that picture up there, I do feel like that's what we're going to see. So each town, city is going to have hopefully a network of these community-owned facilities and corporate-owned facilities with people being trained in them, doing practicum work, different clinical protocols, different experiences, different sets and settings, and they're going to have different combinations of psychedelic medicines and different licensing signed with Awaken, with Compass, with Numinous, with all these different drug dev companies, Cybin, to use their compounds and their clinical protocols and therapeutic, approaches in those wellness centers. So that was a beautiful slide just to see that. Go, yeah, I feel that.
Was there any disruption there? People like being like, "Oh, MDMA brought to you by MAPS," or "psilocybin brought to you by Compass."
Yeah, there was one or two people that gave a good heckle, and Rick was great. He was like, "Just ask me any questions, don't leave them to the end." So people did. They were like, "Hey, Rick over here," and a couple of people were like, "Yeah," they asked some questions about what we were just saying. How can we deliver this treatment in a really colonized and unequal clinical infrastructure that is deeply unfair, and how can that work, particularly in with this kind of patriarchal clinical Western medical model of it? How can it really be truly accessible? And he gave some really good answers about that. But there's still loads of questions to answer. There was one slide as well that he showed right at the end, and it was something I'd never seen before. It was this idea that by the year 2070, the world will be at net zero trauma. And I'll try my best to describe what he meant there. He's saying basically that by 2070, there's still going to be lots of trauma that's happening in the world. You can't get away from that. He mentioned particularly environmental climate change, refugees. But the new trauma that is created each year will be the same as or less than the amount of old trauma that is healed. So the kind of backlog of trauma that we've got right now, of people particularly that have got trauma for 10, 20 years, they're kind of working through that trauma over the next couple of generations. So old trauma really is being healed, and so that means that the new trauma can also be healed. And so the traumatization level, so he was comparing it to like GDP, gross domestic product, that we've got this kind of gross trauma level, that is being held at a low level. Because right now, that if you imagine that as a line, it's going up and up and up on the graph of gross national trauma. It's going up higher than ever. So he's saying we really want to settle that down, and that's going to enable us to have some really deep conversations. So that was pretty profound for me.
I wonder, like, that term, I've heard some people kind of critique this like net zero trauma term, and it makes me wonder, is there a different term that we could like really kind of emphasize resiliency, right? I think about like all my experiences. It's helped me to be more resilient as new traumas emerge, but that trauma never kind of goes away, right? But it does, like, doing this inner work creates a little bit more resiliency. And as you said, trauma is constantly going to happen. It's probably only going to get worse with climate, and just thinking about all the displacement that's probably going to happen as weather patterns get like more intense or flooding starts to happen. But how do these medicines really, I guess, like, provide us more resiliency to face challenges that do occur?
Yeah, that's a beautiful point, isn't it? Yeah, thanks for that, Carl. There was one other piece from, I guess it's Breaking Convention again, it was awesome, but he was talking about how the data that they reviewed shows that MDMA assisted therapy compared to CPT, which is cognitive processing therapy, and EMDR, eye movement desensitization retraining, I think it stands for. Reprocessing. Thanks, man. How the MDMA assisted treatment actually had higher outcomes for trauma symptoms and reduction, but also particularly even more pronounced were the ability of patients to stay within the trial until the end point, I think 12 months later. So the other two methods of CPT and EMDR are so traumatizing in themselves, because you have to re-experience and have exposure to your trauma, that the majority of the patients going through that protocol don't make it to the end, whereas the vast majority of folks going through MDMA assisted treatment do make it through the end. So they get to, one, complete the sequence of treatment, and 2, it's a much more effective treatment anyway, so much lower dropout rate. So that was really significant, just seeing that piece there.
It's huge, right? If we can keep people like continuing with treatment to get them to get better, I think that's a big thing, because I'm sure you've experienced it as a clinician, right? People start and then they just completely drop off. And if we did have this protocol, that these medicines that really allow people to engage, I think that's really big.
Yeah, and I guess accessibility as well. Like, this is going to be expensive, but I know when you're doing prolonged exposure or CPT, that takes months, like maybe 6 months, and it's really difficult. You want to space those sessions out, and maybe need an hour and a half. So, I think when you weigh up the pros and cons, this is going to be more accessible if people can afford it somehow.
Yeah. And then there's one other quote here that was in this article, and this was published in Nature, right? Yeah, Nature. So Rick was saying, what we believe is that the results that we got were not from MDMA. They were from highly trained therapists who are then using MDMA. I find that to be interesting, right? There's that huge emphasis on the therapeutic relationship, and that these substances, these medicines, can really act as an amplifier to maybe help you stick with that process and get into that therapeutic relationship a little bit more. The substance alone, it does have, that big impact, and people obviously get transformation outside of the clinical setting. But I think it is always really important to kind of emphasize the human relationship in healing. It's really, really important.
Yeah, big time. Just moving away from that idea that the medicine, the pill, is going to fix you, and all you have to do is, swallow it.
Yeah.
All right,
David. Well, I know that we're at an hour and you have to run, so maybe we'll save some of these other articles for next time. Well, this has been fun. Anything that you want to close with for today?
No, just lovely to be here. I think I spoke loads about breaking convention. Just always happy just to see how much is going on in the space. So there was other articles we were going to cover, and there's just so much happening. So definitely, if you have some articles you want us to check out, you can send us an email to info@psychedelicstoday.com.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, any questions, comments, anything like that, feel free to send us an email. And then again, if this is your first time tuning in or second time and you haven't subscribed to the show, be sure to do so wherever you listen to podcasts. And I think that is it for this week of Psychedelics Weekly and Psychedelics Today. So we'll catch you on the next episode. So thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and hope everybody has a beautiful day whenever you're listening to this.
Thanks, everyone. God bless.